Today is February 16th, 2018. My name is Martin Frank, and I am in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm interviewing Dr. Barry Pinshow via Skype for the Society's Living History program, while Barry sits in Midreshet Ben Gurion, Israel. Dr. Pinshow is a long-standing member of APS who has been affiliated with the Ben Gurion University of the Negev since 1977. Dr. Pinshow's research has focused on physiological ecology and the physiology of thermoregulation and osmoregulation in desert animals, especially birds, bats, and rodents. Barry, welcome to the Living History Project, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for this series. If you are ready, I would like to ask you a few questions about your career.
Good afternoon, Marty, and thank you for inviting me to be interviewed, although I don't feel that I am quite history yet.
No, not history, but part of the history of the physiological sciences. Barry, in reviewing your CV, I saw that you were born in Johannesburg, South Africa, obviously at a time of apartheid. Can you tell us about your family and what it was like growing up in South Africa?
I lived in South Africa for 14 years, and then I left and came to Israel. During my sojourn in South Africa, some 8 years of school, apartheid was there, and it was never apparent because we were so protected from the surroundings and the goings on in townships and so forth, that we lived a very comfortable, isolated from the blacks, life, and and felt completely free and easy, certainly as a child. It was only when I was about 13 or 14 that I suddenly realized what the state around me was like and didn't like it, which is one of the things that caused me to ask my parents if I could leave and go to Israel, which I did on my own.
I'm assuming that was a hard ask or a hard decision for your parents to send you away.
I don't think they felt they were sending me away. They had in mind the idea of going to Israel for some years. My father wanted to get better established and make some money before he did that. And I think I was the straw that broke the camel's back, because half a year after I left, they followed me and settled down. My dad got a job, and I finished school in Tel Aviv rather than at the boarding school that I began at. So it wasn't too upsetting. My sisters always blamed me for making a family decision, but I didn't. And if my parents hadn't come, I would have stayed anyway and finished school at the boarding school I was at, which I felt that was my place.
I'm curious what your parents did when they were in South Africa and what profession they took up when they came to Israel.
Well, they didn't change professions. My father was an architect, and he came to Israel and got a job in the Ministry of Housing. He was advisor to 3 ministers of housing and did quite a lot of planning while he was still alive. My mom was an industrial psychologist. At the time, they were called time and motion experts, and she worked in the we call it the rag trade.
Okay.
She worked in factories where she figured out how it would be most comfortable and for workers to work and productive. It was something that was just beginning to happen at the time. She had been she worked in the mint in South Africa during the war as a fitter and turner, making cannon barrels and train wheels and stuff. And she knew what it was like to be uncomfortable in a working environment, and decided she would make a profession of making people more comfortable in their environments.
Okay. You became interested in science, unless I'm mistaken from our conversation, when you got to Israel, or perhaps it was in South Africa. I don't recall, but can you tell us how you got interested in science?
Well, I was an inveterate bird watcher when I was very small. And I had an uncle who had a peripheral interest in science, and I had lots of friends who were scientists. His name was Samuel Jaff, and I'm indebted to him for getting me interested in birds. And he gave me a pair of binoculars and sat me down in his garden and said, look at this book and tell me what you've seen, and would come back an hour or two later, and I would give him a list. Well, before I could write, I showed him the pictures, and then I started making a list of the birds I'd seen, and he got me interested and introduced me to some of his scientist friends. And I was a turner over of rocks and look about me person. I liked to be out and do that kind of thing. And I'd always liked. I always had a chemistry set, collected gunpowder, did all the things that little boys interested in science, and unfettered by the laws today. I could buy firecrackers, I could buy magnifying glasses and burn ants and do all the things that people frown upon today. And little by little got really interested in science in general, and had been a member of the Nature Preservation Society since I was a small kid. I used to skip school and go and work in the garden of Professor Heinrich Mendelssohn at Tel Aviv University, where they had a little zoo, and they never asked us, the boys who were there or the girls, why they weren't in school at the time, which suited me just fine. And eventually I ended up working for the Nature Preservation Society as a nature guide, and then joined the Army. And I'd always been interested in nature, especially geology. In fact, I signed up for geology. I was rejected from the university, the Hebrew University, when I applied to do geology there. So I ended up doing biology at Tel Aviv.
All right. You served in the Israeli army. Was that after high school that you go right into the army? And if so, what was your placement there?
I went to the army in January 1966, and I was which was a volunteer unit, a paratrooping unit, and I was a medic. I did a medical corpsman's course, because that was something you could do without a CO telling you what to do. Everything else a CO can tell you what to do and when to do it. And if you're a medic and you have a job to do, nobody excepting you is there to make the decisions. And I like that.
All right. You received your bachelor's degree from Tel Aviv University in biology.
Yeah.
Tell us about the circumstances there, and then ultimately how that education played a role in your decision to pursue a PhD degree.
I never had a PhD in mind, and neither did I have doing a BSc in biology in mind. But while I was a ranger for the Nature Reserves Authority in Eilat, I spent a lot of time on the beach in Eilat, and there were courses of marine biology that came there, and a professor at Tel Aviv University by the name of Lev Fishelson who watched me. Yes, I was sent to be a gopher for him by the head of our field school, who was trying to get his crew educated, and sent us to listen to everything that we could. University courses in all kinds of courses, geology courses, marine biology courses, desert biology courses, botany courses, and we hung around and listened. And I had no real education yet, but we listened. And he noticed that I was particularly interested in actually marine biology at the time, and in February of 1968, when I was going to finish my military service, asked me whether I was interested in going to university. And I said, well, I had no high school degree. So he said, well, the dean of all universities here had the prerogative of taking somebody to their departments on approval if they showed promise. And it was an interview process. Would I like to be interviewed? And I said I would, and gave him my particulars. And I never received anything from Tel Aviv University. A few weeks later, he came back to the beach in Eilat and said, did you get an invitation to an interview? And I said, no, and I hadn't expected to. And he said, well, the dean's here. How would you like to be interviewed here now? I did it. And 2 weeks later, I was accepted. We sat on the beach on a towel, them on two ends of the towel, on one end of the towel and me on the other. And I was accepted at Tel Aviv University without a matriculation, which was sort of acceptable then, because they knew that that I couldn't write exams in English, and Hebrew was a real problem after a couple of years to write Hebrew literature and a Hebrew exam, and chemistry in Hebrew and biology in Hebrew, which I got an A+ for, despite the fact that I didn't know much Hebrew. okay, so in October 1968, I went to Tel Aviv University and thought I was going to study biology, and it turned out that it was all math, physics and chemistry, and boy, was I lost.
But clearly you managed to get your degree in biology anyways, and you went on to get a PhD, but what made you decide, since, as you said, you weren't even sure you were going to get a bachelor's degree in biology?
Well, there was a professor at Tel Aviv University by the name of Amiram Shkolnik, who lots of physiologists who must have known, and he taught us comparative physiology. And one day I read a paper, I think it was by Emily Shirley and Knut Schmidt-Nielsen, about the fat sand rat, Samoas obesus, and the fact that they only ate plants of the Kinomode family, and there was no free calcium in them. And they had fed some labeled oxalic acid with carbon 14 to fat sand rats, and it came out in the animal's breath. And they suggested that this might be because of bacterial activity in the gut. And I went to Shkolnik and I said to him, look at this interesting question. And he said, well, why don't you do a master's? Stay here and do a master's and figure that one out. At the time, analysis of those chemicals was quite difficult. And you know that beta counters and stuff were quite primitive back then. And I was so excited I hit the ceiling. I was so the compliment was so, I felt was so great. And I went home dancing to tell my father. And my father was a wise man, and he said to me, this is great, but are you going to continue your higher education? I said, Dad, I never thought about it, but yeah, why not? And he said, well, then I have one bit of advice. Go back to Shkolnik and say to him, and this I tell every student who ever came into my office, go back and tell him that if you're going to continue your education, you should go to the best place that will take you. It might be Tel Aviv University, but it might be elsewhere. My dad had in mind Harvard, Stanford, I don't know, Ivy League, Oxford, Cambridge. And so I went back to Shkolnik and I told him that, and he said, your father's absolutely right. Sit down. You're interested in the biology of desert animals. Let's think about the best people in the field that you could possibly go and study with. Well, Schmidt-Nielsen had published Desert Animals in 1964, and the papers I'd read by Bartholomew and people like Calder at Arizona, and I applied to 5 different universities, and I wrote letters to the people that I thought might be. This is what Shkolnik suggested I do: write to the people who I might go and study with, and Knut wrote me a handwritten letter saying, if you get into do graduate school, I'll consider taking you as a student. And I didn't look in any other direction. I applied. I went there in January 1972. And after a few weeks, he told me that he'd accept me as a student, and I got a TA and stayed there.
What was it like working in Canutes' laboratory, working on your doctorate? And I know it was a center of comparative exchange, and people were coming and going. So what was it like working for your doctorate in Schmidt-Nielsen's laboratory, and who were the people that most touched you for your experiences?
Well, it was an awesome environment. The awesome part was that I felt that everybody around me in the graduate student group was smarter than I was, and there were some really fantastic people there. My office mate was Dan Rubenstein, who's chair of Ecology and Evolution at Princeton today. Mimi Kuhl she's a member of the academy. They were the people. The group was fantastic, and I felt that I was ill prepared for where I was. Once, a semester out of undergraduate in Tel Aviv, I wasn't ready for this big environment. But it turned out that there was something there that I had learned that got maybe being a little older, having been in the military, helped. And Knut said to me when he accepted me as a student, "You've done enough courses in Tel Aviv. They've taught you enough zoology and botany and whatever you need. What you need to do is to learn how to do research," which I'd never done anything of any consequence, project here and there. And he said, choose somebody in the lab, doesn't matter whom, and go and learn how to do research. And I looked at this group on Friday afternoon seminar, which was always over a bottle of wine that Knut explained. And there were people there, I think Delbert Kilgore was there and Marvin Bernstein. There were 4 graduate students. There were maybe 3-4 postdocs and 4 graduate students. And one of the graduate students standing at the sides with arms akimbo in a T-shirt and Levi cords was Michael Fedak, who is a retired professor from St. Andrews these days. And he just looked right. He had no shoes on actually in the lab. So and I said to Knut, I'll work with him. I didn't know what he was doing yet. And he was following up on Dick Taylor's experiments, who had been running animals on four-legged animals on treadmills and working out the cost of locomotion. Fedak was comparing them to 2-legged animals because they had found that it cost a 70-kilo dog half of what it costs a 70-kilo man to move a unit mass, a unit distance. And so they were looking at birds that run on 2 legs, because there aren't many animals that run on 2 legs, and it was difficult to run, although Henry Prang had it in mind to run basilisk lizards, the cost of walking on water. So I set about running birds with him on treadmill, and got hold of some geese from Peter Klopfer's behavior farm. He gave me 3 geese to run on the treadmill, and they waddle. And it cost them double what it cost a goose. It cost a turkey of the same size to cover a given distance. And I said, there's my problem. What are the mechanical differences between these 2 animals that allow the turkey to run so smoothly and the goose has to waddle because it's designed to swim in water? And I started to read about animals that walk on land on 2 legs and walk long distances. I was looking for something that could really walk on. And of course, penguins immediately came to mind. Although very little was known about them at the time. There were a few dozen papers, mostly French work. But Edward Wilson, not today's Edward Wilson, the doctor who went with Scott to the Antarctic, had taken 2 people with him to, one was absolutely Cherry Rudd, to Cape Crozier during the winter their winter, before they went to the pole in the Antarctic, to collect emperor penguin eggs, because he had discovered in 1902 that the penguins were breeding during the winter. So this was a revelation to me, something everybody knows about because of that great movie, March of the Penguins. And I brought this material to Schmidt-Nielsen. I read French, which was a big advantage. I brought it to Knut and I said, look what I found. Emperor penguins breed during the Antarctic winter. He said, yeah, I heard about that. I said, well, how do they manage? He said, in his inimitable way, and you remember him, stood up and said, why don't you go and find out? And I said to him, how do you do that? He said, well, you might have to write a grant proposal to the National Science Foundation. And I was 3 months out of BSc and I didn't know what a grant proposal was. So he gave me 2 proposals to look at that had been successful and funded, and told me to read them and figure it out from there. And I did. I had the encouragement of Dan Rubenstein in my office, who had written a proposal. He was an NSF Junior Fellow, and he had written a proposal. So he encouraged me and gave me some very good advice. And I landed up being a rich graduate student. And in the meantime, Knut had said that he would not, if I went to Antarctica, my wife had to be employable on the project, because there was plenty of stuff to do in the lab. I could do a PhD on anything I liked in the lab, but he wasn't going to see a young couple split up. And I thought that was sound advice, which my wife did too, Hannah. And he hired her early along as technician in the lab and discovered that she had a way with animals. And she flew birds in wind tunnels and ran birds on treadmills and did all kinds of stuff for him, and graphics and general technician stuff. And then he had a good reason to write her into the grant so that she could go. And she came to Antarctica and she looked after the animals. She didn't only look after the animals, she did a lot with me, because we had separate rooms where an animal was running on a treadmill and somebody had to be inside looking at the gauges and stuff. And we shared the duties with Mike Fedak. In the first year, there was a woman called Katie Music who was along with us, a fourth graduate student. It was quite a lot of work. The second year, the two of us went with another graduate student and did all the thermoregulatory stuff. We had a chamber where we could take birds down to minus 50 degrees and keep them there for as long as we needed to make metabolic measurements and evaporative water loss and the rest. So we went down together, and she was one of 3 women on a base of about 600 men. It was interesting, never hassled by anybody ever, which was to the Navy's credit, because they were running the base at the time. Some guys sometimes cried on the shoulder because they had nobody else to talk to when they were missing home, but otherwise everything went really well. And after 3.5 years of getting it all done, I said to Schmidt-Nielsen, okay, now we know how they manage, but why do they breed during the winter in the Antarctic? And Knut raised his eyebrow at me and said, what do you think? And I said, well, I think that they can't handle the heat of the Antarctic summer. And his eyebrow went up to his hairline, because he thought that was a crackpot idea. But he said, didn't say don't do it. He said, look, you're going to have to figure that out, and you can't go back to Antarctica to do it. But Warren Porter, who calls himself a biophysical ecologist, has just been here to give a seminar, and maybe you should talk to him about doing a postdoc and learning how to use your data that you've collected, the physiological data, with environmental data, and figure out what's going on with these birds and whether they could be out in the blistering Antarctic heat, which is what I did for a postdoc. I went and studied biophysical ecology with Warren. I'm still interested in that, and I still do that kind of thing. The answer, of course, was negative. They never see a day hot enough to make their body temperatures rise, because of the heat sink of all the ice and snow and rocks and sea around them keep the temperature, an operative temperature of below freezing all the time. So there was not. So that was. But publishing negative data is something that's important to do. And that my second paper that I wrote, or my third paper, was negative results, which is good to know what they don't do. But I still don't know the answer to that. I still don't know why. I asked all the ecologists in the world, and they give me all kinds of crackpot reasons. It cost me a lot of beer.
Yeah, but it's at least enjoyable, sitting and arguing science in the bar. Clearly, penguins were your dissertation route. You also have an extensive interest, as I said, in desert biology. Tell us a bit more about studies that you have done in other areas related to desert biology.
Well, it's the tools that count, okay? It doesn't matter whether you're working on penguins in Antarctica or in the tropical forest. The basic tools of studying metabolic function or acid-base balance, which I got into quite a bit, or whatever. The basic tools are the basic tools. It's the questions that you ask that count. My questions were always ecological questions that needed physiological tools to answer them. I had a couple of the first thing I did when I came here was I was always a bird watcher, and there are 2 species of partridge that live in our desert: the chukar and the sand partridge. The chukar lives in all the music areas in Israel, everywhere down to about the 200 millimeter rainfall line, or maybe even further than that, depending on the conditions, into more desert areas where there are good conditions. Well, that we found out later. Sand partridges, on the other hand, are found everywhere in the desert where up to the 200 millimeter rainfall line approximately. And or a little below it. They overlap between the 200 millimeter and the 100 millimeter rainfall lines, chukkas and sand partridges. And you don't find chukkas where the sand partridges are in the extreme desert. And the question was, were they different in their physiological capabilities? And might it have been that competition has separated them? And because animals, as far as I know, are in the desert either because they're outcompeted by other species and need to live in less productive environments, or the desert is formed around them over evolutionary history, and they found themselves isolated because the desert is formed around them and they've evolved to stay there. And examined the partridges for a long time, especially in terms of evaporative water loss, metabolism. Found that, like other animals that had been studied until then, that they were quite frugal in their water use. Their energy use was a little lower than might be expected on the basis of allometry. And the thing that clinched it was that they spread their ranges during drought years. They move into areas where there were chukkas, and the chukkas move away where it's more productive, and the sand partridges encroach on those areas. Then when it rains again and things become lush, the sand partridges move back to the desert. That's by collecting all the observations of all the bird watchers that I could find in Israel. I have a whole list of them in the maps that I made at the time by collecting this information. So it seems that they might have be one of those species that is in the less productive areas because it can manage there. And then I went on to studying evaporative water loss and used the pigeons as a model animal. I hate using that word. Pigeons are the quintessential desert animal and shouldn't be representative of birds because they come from the extreme desert. They're from the cliffs in our region. And people were working on brain temperature cooling. It was a big deal during the early 80s that the reti mirabilis, the ophthalmic reti in birds, as the carotid reti in mammals, the analogous, allows the birds to keep their brains cooler than their bodies. And Marvin Bernstein was studying that in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I asked him about the role of evaporation from ocular surfaces, which still we don't know very much about. And he said, why don't you come and take a look at it? I have a student who's really interested in doing something like that. And we figured out how to implant microthermocouples in pigeon eyes and put them in a small wind tunnel. And I started to get into respiratory and cutaneous evaporation, and decided that I was going to figure out what happens during flight. All the parts of the equation to measure the different channels of water loss in birds in flight. They're respiratory evaporation, cutaneous evaporation, and excretion. And separated them all, and actually we wrote several papers, but there's one missing detail that I once mentioned to you, that we've never managed to measure tidal volume in birds, so we don't know exactly what the respiratory component comprises of. We measured everything else: respiratory frequency during flight, evaporative temperature, exhaled air temperature, from which we calculated what we could about respiratory evaporation. But that's a missing link that I would have liked to have done in a wind tunnel somewhere. I don't know if I'm ever going to see that done or do it myself. But we spent 10 years flying Tippler pigeons around here. They fly for several hours at a time. Watch out for that parrot above your head. It's
yeah, I brought that back from Mexico many years ago.
I hope it's cloaca plugged.
It is, and it's trained, so it won't do anything on the desktop.
Well,
so
to collect excretion during flight, we actually managed to do that by taking the fingers from a rubber glove, rolling them back a little, easy to imagine, and then plucking a few feathers around the bird's fence and sticking it there with super glue for the duration of a 4 or 5 hour flight. So if you weighed the bag before, we know they're impermeable to water. If you weigh the little bag before and stick it on, bury it in the feathers, and collect it afterwards, after the flight, you could weigh it again. You know what the wet droppings were, and then you could dry that and calculate also the water content of that. So it was a very, very productive and interesting period. And got involved in studies of migratory birds and body composition, and drifted with the questions as it was.
Which is what science is all about. Every experiment creates a new question that needs to be pursued. Remind me of when you got to Gurion University and what it was like then and what it's like now. And I know you found a nice benefactor to help the institution a number of years ago.
When I came here, I was one of the first people in the Institute for Desert Research. I was the first junior faculty member hired, because the people who had been hired after the country decided that it was going to have an Institute for Desert Research, and the job had been given to Gurion University in 1974, there were no resources yet. Accepting some positions, that was, I guess, the most important thing. And where we are, where this institute is where Ben-Gurion is buried, which is quite a famous site. Today it's an incorporated township called Midreshet Ben-Gurion, and there are several hundred families living here, and a graduate school and a high school for environmental studies, and several other things, everything to do with education. I came here and we were given the classrooms of a defunct high school. It had not worked. We were given the classrooms, and I was given a room that was 7 meters by 7 meters. That's not small, 49 square meters. That's not a small lab space, but there was nothing in it. It was empty. There was a sink. And the director of the institute says, we have no money yet. So whatever you do now is going to be up to you. And I thought, as an incoming faculty member with no startup money, that was going to be rough. But there were two things that happened, and you asked about influential people other than Schmidt-Nielsen and FIDAC. I thought that I should figure out how. I knew that at the Weizmann Institute, they had lots of arrangements with universities in the United States where they could get an NSF grant or NIH grant and bring the equipment to a university with a contract with it. So knowing that Marvin Bernstein in New Mexico, who I hadn't worked with yet, in Las Cruces, might be interested, because we have a common genetic background, he might be interested in doing something like that. And we actually married our campuses, which gave us the chance to write an NSF proposal, which we got. And Marv came here and did a 6-month sabbatical, bringing the equipment we needed for looking at respiratory evaporative water loss in pigeons and chuckers and sand partridges, which we did as well. And at that time, my mother played cards with Lady Edith Wolfson, and she told my mom told Lady Edith about what we were doing here, and she said, well, my husband contributes a lot of money to Israel. Maybe your son will come and talk to him. Anyway, she died, but I was invited to an interview, and Wolfson gave me enough money to buy equipment to start a proper lab. At the same time, I got a Binational Science Foundation grant with Marvin Bernstein, and things got rolling. A couple of years later, I met the woman after whom our department is named, Louise Mitrani. She turned out to be a bird watcher, and we became friends. And when she passed away, she left us a small endowment which helps run the infrastructure of our department, which is great. But I managed after that to get successive grants over the years from the Israel Science Foundation, from the Binational Science Foundation, from the Rothschild Fund, and keep an active lab going until a few years ago, when at 68 you have to retire here. It's not a question of whether you want to or not. We don't have the same laws as in the States. We have retirement laws, and at 68 you retire. You don't have to stop working if you have lab space, and you're allowed to write grant proposals. But by law you have to retire. And I decided I was going to go in a different direction for two reasons. I found it very difficult to spend a third of my time writing protocols for ethical committees, especially because we have a medical school and nobody has any idea of what it's like to work with wild animals. I never had a problem getting licensed to work with wild animals from the authorities who are concerned with wildlife, but the university wanted me to keep wild sparrows and bats in sterile conditions like they keep lab rats, and you can't do that. So I decided I was going to turn to other things and started working on biophysical problems, which really interested me, especially burrow ventilation, which was very nicely supported by the American Physiological Society, which encouraged me to go and work that out, and I did with Scott Turner from SUNY Syracuse, and we began working on. After working on rodent burrows, we started to work on invert burrows, especially scorpions, and recently spiders, and how scorpion burrows manage not to be ventilated because scorpions might not be interested in being desiccated by warm air coming into their burrows during the day. They don't block their burrows. Spiders sometimes cap their burrows, some don't, and we worked on how they manage to keep the environment at a reasonably cool and damp environment, so that they could pass the days when they weren't hunting in non-desiccating conditions, which we've done a lot of, and all this came together in making an online course in biophysical field methods, which is online, and you're invited to see it, to join, to take the course. I have 64 students online right now, which is great, and eventually I suggested to Scott Turner that we turn this into an active course and take students who've done our online course to Namibia, to Gobabib, where lots of comparative physiologists have been, and study biophysical field methods there, which we've done twice so far, and we're currently setting up to go again in June this year and do it again. And that's what I'm really into, for teaching biophysical field methods rather than physiology in class, which I did for quite long enough, I think.
I can appreciate that. Barry, you and I go way back. You became a member in 1981, for those of you who are listening. And I think our first meeting was at our centennial meeting, where you were one of the many international invited lecturers that we brought to the meeting. Tell us about APS, your relationship with us, and how our meetings have contributed to your career and your students, and how current meetings, not at APS because I know you don't come all that often anymore, but how current meetings have changed in your estimation.
The first meeting I went to was to APS Atlantic City in 1973. In 1972, the lab went without me. The next meeting I went to, with a bunch of us with a bunch from the lab who stayed in a motel room where we paid for 3 people, and the rest of the 4 others slept in sleeping bags on the floor. And we walked towards the convention center there, and every morning and had breakfast at this place where these 2 Jewish ladies who served the best bacon and eggs breakfast you can possibly imagine along the way. And what Knut did was tell us to hang around and he'd introduce us to people. I mean, that's what your advisor is for, to introduce you to people. And met lots and lots and lots of people there. And I didn't give a paper until I came back from Antarctica the second time, and I submitted a paper in the competition for the Harewood Sea Belding Award.
Right.
I think that was in 1974. Yeah, it was in April '74, and came back from Antarctica and went to that meeting, and I actually won the prize. It was enough to buy an HP 25 calculator, which was the hottest thing on the shelf. So I met there. The prize was presented to me by Ethan Nadel and Don Jackson, if I recollect correctly. So that was the important thing, meeting these people, hearing about what other people were doing. I was just fascinated and kept on going to APS meetings for all the years. It was always the comparative section of the APS. I've served on there. I'm still on one of the committees. I'll be finished soon. For all the years, and slowly graduated to going to American Society of Zoology meetings as well, because I found that there was a mix there of things that were really useful to me, especially the biomechanics and stuff they were talking about. They changed the name to Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology, and the question I kept on asking was, why weren't there any? If it was changed, the name was changed, why was there no plant people there? And apparently they're starting a plant section now. But I've gone to those meetings as well, and actually go to those meetings because of the mix of people that are more ecologists and animal mechanics people than physiologists. And those people have always led me to the interesting physiological questions that I've dealt with over time. And I've been a member of that society. I still go to those meetings when I can. And the big difference is the size.
Right.
The meetings have got bigger and bigger and bigger. There were comparative meetings every 4 years, I think, that I went to the APS comparative meetings, and they were handled. You knew everybody there. There were a couple of hundred people there in different sessions, discussing all kinds of interesting topics, from scaling to respiratory function, all kinds of things. And then the meetings got bigger and bigger and bigger, and that is what's happened in SICB meetings as well. This year there were over 2,000 people there, and there were so many sessions that were parallel that you couldn't hear all the things that you wanted to hear. That happened to APS long ago, and that's the big difference. You don't recognize all the faces,
right?
And they're in huge hotels. They don't serve breakfast, and sometimes make you pay for internet connections.
Well, I will say that if you're interested, this fall, we will have another comparative meeting, as you said, every 4 years. So hopefully you'll make it across to the States for that. Barry, you and I have talked a lot, and I know you are committed to students and to mentoring. And with that in mind, what advice would you give students starting out in science today?
Become an engineer before you start studying biology or physiology. It's funny. First of all, what my dad instilled in me: go to the best university that will take you. That's important, and it's problematic in the States because some of those places to be an undergraduate is hugely expensive, and we don't have that problem. Undergraduate study here is almost free. It costs $4,000 a year at the best universities here.
Is that for Israeli students or also for foreign students?
Any student who comes here and studies, it's hard for an American to be an undergraduate here because it's all in Hebrew.
Oh, okay.
But in general, the tuition is not more than $4,000 a year, even if you go to medical school. So nobody gets into huge debt, which is really important. And then if you go to graduate school in the States, you become a TA, so you don't run into debt either, because there's got to be funding from somewhere. You can't go and fund yourself through graduate school. That's the first thing. Go to the best graduate school that will take you. Maybe that's a better way of putting it then, because you probably need to go in your own country, especially if you get free education, like in some European countries. And if you want to be a biologist, what I suggested to my son, and I think this is true, biologists do not get enough math, physics, and chemistry in their training, really. And when somebody starts out and wants to get a first degree, especially in America, I would suggest to anybody to do a 4-year engineering degree. My son did it here when I suggested it to him, because he didn't know what he wanted to do. But you come out with tools that will lead you anywhere. If you want to be a philosopher, if you want to study biology or history or anything else, you have an engineering degree in hand and have a job, right? You certainly get a job. So if I had studied linear algebra when I was a biology student, I would have been able to understand the statistics that I was doing long before I studied it on my own, which was rough. And they don't teach biologists linear algebra. You get 2 math courses maybe as a biologist, and it's far from sufficient. And people now rely on program packages like R to do their statistics for them. And I don't know if the students who study today could sit down and do a linear regression on an HP15 calculator like we had to do back then and understand what they're looking at, which I find quite serious among our students. Also, read books. It's amazing how many students come around from the best universities, and you say to them, "Here, take this book and read it, and then we'll have a common language." And they look on Wikipedia,
right?
Which is a great source of information. And if there was nothing else on the internet, I'd go on paying whales $50 a year to keep Wikipedia running, because I find it so incredibly useful. But reading is got to be built into every scholar, and I think that's what we're losing something by not encouraging true scholarship, which we were much encouraged by Schmidt-Nielsen to read, not just to read science, to read outside of science as much as we could. And he even every now and again gave us books. He gave me Penguin Island by Anatole France when I passed my orals.
Okay.
Which has nothing to do with biology. It's about a myopic priest who tries to convert the penguins on an island to Christianity.
I don't think I've read that one.
It's marvelous. And the students, it's very frustrating. I said something to two of my students, my technician and a postdoc. I said something about that was going to be their albatross. They were doing something that was really going to drag them down. And they looked at me, and I think they figured out that I meant a yoke around their necks. And I said, "You know what I'm talking about? Have you ever read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner?"
Right.
Well, they hadn't, so I called up Richard Burton on YouTube. And if you ever want to enjoy 11 minutes, Richard Burton reads The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's absolutely fun in that incredible voice. And they understood what
the albatross was.
What the albatross was. And I think that's very much missing. I'm not a poetry reader, but I read literature, and I've always have, and I've never stopped reading. I think that is as important to one's education, and travel.
Right.
Travel as much as you can, whenever you can. Stop what you're doing and go with somebody. If somebody offers to take you as a field assistant to Hellengon, go. Don't hesitate. That's more. You learn more in 4 days in a new place than you learn in class. That's for sure.
Barry, let me thank you for your willingness to be history, as you noted at the beginning, and sit for an interview for the Living History program. Personally, I regret that I wasn't able to fly over to Israel to conduct this interview, and you couldn't come to San Diego to have it done at the annual meeting. But I do hope our paths cross again in the not too distant future. I respect your research and I appreciated your friendship over the years. So I thank you on behalf of anybody who might actually watch this video to thank you for giving them an opportunity to learn a little bit about you.
It's always fun to talk about oneself. Nobody wants to talk to me at all. You know, I'm retired. I'm thank you very much for inviting me.